Hello, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I am Ryan Wormeli, joined on this Tuesday morning by Andrew Erickson and by our guest, Joe Orrico. He is at NoExpertFF on Twitter. Joe, it is Thanksgiving week. It is a holiday week, as I just said, so I appreciate you making the time for us.
Literally nowhere else I'd rather be. Thanks for having me, guys.
We love having you, Erickson. It's a busy week, so I guess for the one and only time, I will also thank you for making the time to be on your own show here. We are talking Week 12. It's just so hard to believe we're already here. Week 12, buy low, sell high, wide receivers on this show. We will start, as we always do, with the most traded wide receiver. And guys, the number one most traded wide receiver was somebody who was a top 3 pick in every fantasy league this August, and that's Ja'Marr Chase. Obviously, I would assume this is a reaction to the Joe Burrow injury news. He is out for the remainder of the season. So Chase is somebody who has been banged up a little himself. Obviously, Burrow has not been fully healthy for a lot of the year outside of a few weeks stretch there in the middle. But Joe, I'll start with you. Chase, I mean, such a big name, such a big talent, now dealing with Jake Browning as his quarterback. Are you buying, selling, or holding on him right now?
I'm actually looking to buy Ja'Marr Chase. I'm one of the guys who is in the office looking for Ja'Marr Chase as like a wide receiver 2 for my team or a wide receiver 1 next to another strong wide receiver 1. So I see him on the website, expert consensus, rest of season, 18 overall. I think it's a little low. Joe Burrow is great. He's awesome. He's like one of the best. But Ja'Marr Chase is really, really good at football. And I would go as far as saying he's the best player in the offense. He's going to get work, okay, a lot of it. And the schedule's great. Pittsburgh, Jacksonville, Indy, Minnesota, Pittsburgh again. Then in week 17, you get Kansas City. So I'm in on Ja'Marr Chase. I had him as a top 3 guy. I still have him as a top 15, top 13, 12 guy. So I'm in. I'm buying.
Yeah, what are you doing with Chase, Erickson? Because, like Joe mentioned in the consensus, he's in that, wide receiver 2 range moving forward. It just sounds so low for a guy of his talent, but situation does matter, right?
Yeah, no, I think it does. And we saw Chase during the beginning of the season kind of start slow with a not 100% Joe Burrow. He was wide receiver 27 in terms of points per game in the first month of the season. So I think that's kind of where you should be looking to acquire him for. I really think that Chase is really about the price because we know that his ability as a receiver, especially what he can do after the catch, like that, it doesn't matter who the quarterback is. Like once the ball is in his hand, it's up to Chase to make plays and to make guys miss and to score touchdowns and show off how good he is. So I think it's just worth kicking the tires on Chase and just sending offers just to kind of see like how panicked is this manager on Ja'Marr Chase, but also entertain the idea that if you have Chase, there's a lot more risk now involved with his bust potential with a bad quarterback. So I wrote in the forecast buy/sell Ja'Marr Chase because I really think it's like the price for him is going to vary all around. And after the game on Thursday, I posted a poll on Twitter, was like, who scores more fantasy points, Ja'Marr Chase or Zay Flowers, rest of the season? And it was pretty split. I think that Chase ended up winning 55% to 45%, but I mean, as we'll get into a little bit later, Zay Flowers is set up really well the rest of the season without Mark Andrews in that offense. So I think that's the price you should be looking to pay for a guy like Chase. So again, I kind of agree with Joe that I do want to buy on Chase because of someone I liked a lot, but I also understand, hey, if I don't want to deal with this risk here, I have a team that's really, really good, and Chase really hasn't been the guy that's been making my team better. I feel okay moving him away if I already feel good about the rest of my roster for a safer asset. He just comes with a lot of risk. I think that he's a boom or bust guy to trade for. So if you're kind of fighting for that last roster spot, you need a spark on your offense, I think Chase is a guy to go for. But if you feel really good about your team, you're like, I don't need to take on this risk, I would probably ship off Chase. So again, a lot of context, but I think that it's a really polarizing situation with Chase, how good he is, but based on the current quarterback situation.
So if he is a boom or bust guy, where do you see yourself ranking him, not just rest of the season, but week to week? Like, for example, in week 12 specifically, he's wide receiver 20 right now. That feels like almost kind of a placeholder of like people don't really know what to do. And that's kind of the range where you're not going to get too burned if he has a really good game, but also not if he has a really bad game. So on a week to week basis, Erickson, where do you think you're going to end up with Chase, not just looking in the aggregate rest of season?
Well, I mean, like, where do you rank Garrett Wilson every week? It's kind of like the same thing. Like, he's really good, but he has a really bad quarterback that you can't necessarily rely on. And I mean, he had 12 yards 12 receiving yards. I think that's the lowest he's ever had in a game, with Jake Browning basically being the quarterback for the most of that game. And T. Higgins is also going to come back. Like, we've seen the splits with Chase be much better when Higgins is hurt. Higgins is going to come back unless for some reason they keep him out because their season is basically going down the toilet at this point without Joe Burrow. So we'll see how that kind of plays out. I guess for me, it's like I feel more confident it's like getting rid of Joe Mixon, to be totally honest. Like, when I'm looking at the Bengals offense, I'd rather trade him away and buy Chase than bet on, Joe Mixon, the team will run. Because I think that there's a merit to, they're going to run the ball more. It's like, I don't care. Joe Mixon, I don't think is a good enough running back to overcome that. So it's like, if I had Mixon, I would trade him for Jamar Chase. Like, if you want to try to make a bet on which Bengals player is better, the schedule's better for the receiver versus the running back. So I guess for me, he's going to be a wide receiver 2 ranked every week. He probably won't finish there. It'll probably be, actually, no, I think he probably will. Because if you look at Garrett Wilson, what he's done this year with bad quarterbacks, like, I think the highest he's finished is like wide receiver 15. Like, he just can't get over the hump because the team can't score touchdowns. And if that's the case with the Bengals, you're never going to see Chase get over the hump unless he just rips off an 80-yard touchdown because of how good he is with the ball in his hands.
That is right, by the way. Wide receiver 15 is Garrett Wilson's highest finish this season in half PPR. He's also had a wide receiver 16 and 18. Everything else is 23 or below. So he has not, gotten into that mid wide receiver 2 range like we're kind of hoping for Chase. Joe, I want to ask you about some real life trades that have gone down. This is data pulled from our Fantasy Pros My Playbook app. Again, these are real life trades, so I want to get your opinion. A lot of big names being moved for Chase here, at least in terms of name value, maybe not in terms of how we value them rest of the season. So we'll see what you think about these. Jamar Chase and Devon Achane for Austin Eckler.
I am going to lean the Chase and Achane side on that one.
How about Jamar Chase for Zay Flowers plus Chris Olave?
Jamar Chase.
The last one here, Jamar Chase for Javonte Williams plus Puka Nacua.
That one I will go Javonte and Puka.
Erickson, what do you think about those? I'll run through them again. Chase and Achane for Eckler. Chase for Flowers and Olave. Chase for Javonte and Puka.
I actually like the Eckler deal. I think that you're trading 2 very boomer bust assets for a very safe asset with Eckler. I mean, I feel very strongly about Eckler's top 5 rest of season ranking at a running back, whereas Achane, okay, is he gonna play? Like, what's the deal with his injury? Like, is he gonna be back? Like, is he gonna get enough touches? Like, what's the deal? And then with Chase, obviously, we talked about, he comes with a lot of unknown risk as well. So if I just want to I want a locked and loaded RB1 rest of the season, just get Eckler on your team. And Chase could be a way that you can acquire him for someone that wants to take on more of a boom or bust profile with Chase and the downgraded quarterback.
Let's move to the next most traded wide receiver, and that's Nico Collins. Joe, starting with you, buying, selling, or holding on the Texans wide receiver?
So Nico Collins is going to go hand in hand with my sell high later. Little tease there, but I'm buying for sure. CJ Stroud looks fantastic. The schedule is okay, but I do think there's going to be some, as the cool kids say, positive regression here for Nico Collins. 11 targets in week 11, kind of just flies under the radar. He's been doing that the last couple weeks. So I'm in on Nico. He's a different kind of receiver than Tank Dell, and eventually it's going to even out a little bit here.
Erickson, where do you have Nico Collins rest of the season? He's wide receiver 24, so just barely sneaks into that wide receiver 2 range in the consensus rankings.
I'm a little higher. I have him at wide receiver 22. So, I think that he's a strong buy candidate as well, just based on the fact that, he led the team in targets last week. I know Tank Dell is putting up 140 yards every single week, seemingly, but look, if you can get a cheap part of this offense, every time I looked up watching Red Zone this past week, the Texans were in the red zone. And I was like, they're in the red zone again? Stroud is just on another level right now.
Yeah.
He's I think he's top 7 or top 6 for me in my rest of the season rankings at quarterback. So you got to get as many pieces of this offense as you humanly can. They have 2 matchups against the Titans rest of the way. So, Nico Collins, I think that he's a more inconsistent than Tank Dell because of the way he operates. He's a perimeter receiver, relies a lot on yards after the catch, but his role is confirmed though. It's concrete what he does. Whereas when Noah Brown comes back, when Robert Woods is playing, what are these guys going to do when they're all healthy on the field at the same time? I think they overlap a little bit more with what Tank Dell does. So, I think Collins as the clear-cut X wide receiver on the outside. I like attaching myself to that, especially because he's seeing a ton of red zone targets. He had 4 red zone targets last week, didn't score, but Stroud is obviously looking for him when they're trying to put it in the end zone.
Joe, before we get to the real trades that have gone down, I just want to follow up on Nico with, like, he had obviously that amazing start to the season, right? Where he had 2 top 4 finishes in the first 4 weeks. Outside of those 2 games, though, he hasn't actually had that many great finishes this year. Part of that is because his big yardage games were also when he scored the touchdowns. So it all kind of got thrown into the same game. And then the scoring hasn't quite been there other weeks. But if you look at his finishes at the position week to week, he has those 2 games. He has a wide receiver 11 finish where he finished with 13 half PPR points. Everything else is like wide receiver 28, wide receiver 27, wide receiver 52, wide receiver 32. There's not a ton of these high level performances. Does that concern you at all about him being maybe a little boom bust?
A little bit, but to be honest, if he's the wide receiver 2 on my roster, that's totally fine with me. You can nitpick and we can go through and say he was injured this game. Okay, he played Atlanta that game. That's a tough one. We can do that. Played Carolina. Both those games were away. Or we can just say CJ Stroud had 250 yards at halftime in week 11. I'm in. And they play Tennessee twice to end the season. And honestly, we're at that point in the year where it's like, this is a guy I can buy. We're going to make a decision here. We're going to do it. And we're risking it a little bit. And guess what? If it works, we're going to get 30-point performances here, a couple of those to close the season. Maybe 2 of them are in the playoffs. So if I can get him as a wide receiver 2, right, I'm totally fine with a boom bust, if you will. Wide receiver 2 underneath a stud, PPR stud like Keenan Allen, for example, at wide receiver 1. Bring on the boom bust then, if that's the case. So again, all about roster construction. And I was nitpicking, a little bit there. And then I just said, you know what? All you have to do is watch CJ Stroud. So.
Yeah, well, that's pretty good analysis.
You know what I mean?
CJ Stroud, literally any stat I'm in.
Yeah, you just don't need to overcomplicate it sometimes.
And when you look too, like at the schedule, you can just kind of see it lining up where he's going to have a massive game and then have so he's playing the Jaguars this week. That's a good matchup. He should probably boom. Next week, Denver might get Surtain. Okay, he's going to bust. Then he plays the Jets, probably going to bust. But then he plays the Titans, probably going to boom. Then he plays the Browns, probably going to bust. Then he plays the Titans again, he's probably going to boom. So it's going to be a roller coaster, but if you can bank on a 30-point game in the fantasy playoffs from Nico Collins, that's going to help your team in the long run. So I think that's why you can get him because of the roller coaster performance, like you mentioned, Worm, how he's been inconsistent. Well, it's that's why you can buy him because the manager may not realize that.
He's kind of like a very high-end Gabe Davis, if you will. So if you can get Nico in your flex, oh my God, that is the dream.
Yeah,
heading into playoffs.
Yeah. Let me throw some trades your way, Joe. Nico Collins for Jerome Ford.
I'm going to go with Nico Collins there for sure.
How about Nico Collins and Jerry Jeudy for DK Metcalf?
Ooh, that's tough. I think I'm going to go Collins and Jeudy on that one. I believe in Jerry Jeudy to close the season here. Maybe we'll talk about that later, but yeah, I'm going to go Collins and Jeudy.
How about Nico Collins and Bijan Robinson for Jamar Chase?
I'm going to go Nico and Bijan there. Bijan post-buy, 70% of snaps. Sign me up. That playoff schedule is juicy.
Erickson, any of those trades stand out to you? I'll run through them again. Nico Collins for Jerome Ford. Nico and Jerry Jeudy for DK Metcalf. Nico and Bijan for Jamar Chase.
I want the Metcalf side, and you should by no means be trading Jamar Chase or you should not be trading Bijan to get Jamar Chase. You should be on the other side of that deal. I would trade Jamar Chase for Bijan straight up if that's what I would do. So the fact that that deal has another player added, Chase, if that's what you can get, again, that's why it's interesting because Chase's price is so all over the place because people are like, oh, I don't know what to do because he's so good, but it's how bad is this quarterback going to affect the offense? I think that's why you should just be kicking the tires. And if I could get Bijan for Chase, I would be, despite Arthur Smith, whatever, don't care. Yeah. I would be buying Bijan.
Joe, hit me with your top buy low wide receiver right now.
So my top buy low wide receiver heading into week 12 is Diontae Johnson. And we just saw Matt Canada got fired. I would assume that's good news for Diontae, but I think this is all getting a little bit blown out of proportion here with Kenny Pickett, the Diontae Johnson drama, all that. Sometimes you got to just look through it or look the other way. When people zig, we zag. So with Diontae, he has literally had 4 fully healthy games. And, since week 7, in 3 of those, over 30% of targets. And I get it. The passes are coming from Pickett. The pie, if you will, that we're getting the share of isn't as big, right? But when it's over 30%, that's monstrous. And in PPR leagues, right, 3 of the last 4 games, 8+ targets. And we think of his targets kind of, 5 yards here, 6 yards there. He actually, intended air yards per game, minimum targets 30. He's top 20, 98 intended air yards per game. That's tied with Jamar Chase. It's 2 less than CeeDee Lamb, 3 less than Ridley and Metcalf, and a couple less than Brandon Ayuk. So he's in this category, right, where he's actually seeing a ton of air yards, over 100 in week 11. So I think he's a great buy low, and the schedule is fantastic. Cincinnati, Arizona, New England, Colts, Bengals, Seahawks, like every team I just mentioned, I'm not scared of at all. So give me Diontae Johnson. He can be acquired, honestly, for flexes at this point after 2 sub 4-point outings. I'm all over Diontae heading into playoffs.
Yeah, 3 catches on 12 targets for 33 yards across the last 2 weeks. It's just that will stick in people's minds, especially as they get into the playoffs, like feeling like they're taking too much of a risk by holding on to him. So I think you're right. Like, he certainly is gettable. Erickson, where would you have Johnson rest of the season? He's dropped a bit in our consensus rest of season rankings. He's down at wide receiver 36, which I think is too low. Where would you have him, Erickson?
I have him wide receiver 32. And I think, again, what we try to do with the rest of season rankings is obviously we're trying to project like how they would do the rest of the season, but we're also trying to like read the room because people use the rest of season rankings to make trades. So like the market's viewing Diontae Johnson as wide receiver 3. Like, I think that's pretty, and that's why you can get him cheap because like, oh my God, Kenny Pickett's his quarterback. He has no upside. He's never going to do anything. He's never going to score again. Like that's Diontae Johnson in a nutshell. If you ask somebody on the street, it's like, hey, Diontae Johnson, what do you think? It's like, guy can't score, so I don't want him. But as Joe alluded to, is like the targets are there. The dude has been a monster producer. All he does is command targets. So I think that it's on the upswing with Matt Canada out as the OC. The matchups are great for Diontae, and I just have more confidence in him than like a guy like George Pickens, who it's just like he's running go routes on the perimeter, and it's just really hard for him to put up fantasy points that way at a consistent level. So I think that he's a guy you can get cheap, and he's just a good asset to add to a team, especially in full PPR, where you know he's going to get peppered. So
yeah, I mean, people literally think the world is ending with Kenny Pickett. I mean, we saw in week 8 and week 9, Diontae over 16 points both those games. He had 14 targets against Jacksonville. Like, we've seen it with Pickett. They played the Browns last week in Cleveland. Let's just relax.
Pickett, that gave me like a 30-point total, and of course it was horrible.
And Pickett, I'm not saying he's Peyton Manning, but like, relax, we're good. I get he's not great, but it's okay.
Time now for our favorite segment. It's the Uber Eats player we'd give up almost anything for. This week, that player is Erickson's buy low wide receiver, Zay Flowers. Erickson, what makes my guy such a great buy low candidate?
Well, he did score like a 50-yard touchdown on Thursday Night Football.
68-yard touchdown. That was wiped off, yeah.
It was my same-game parlay was not happy about that call. So, Zay Flowers, look, he's going to have to step up. With Mark Andrews out the rest of the year, at least through the fantasy football season, he still played 98% of snaps. He's still clearly the preferred option for Lamar Jackson in the passing game. He's been that guy all year long. We saw back in week 1, Mark Andrews didn't play. What did Zay Flowers do in his first NFL game? 10 targets. Like, the Ravens have one of the better schedules coming up. It's not a schedule where they can just roll over their opponents. They face one of the easier schedules to open the season. They're facing more difficult defenses and just overall teams. So I think you're going to see more back and forth game environments, even though the Ravens defense has been really good. I think that just bodes well for Zay Flowers. So I know that we're all trying to look at Isaiah Likely as like, oh, he's going to smash, like he's going to take over all of Andrews' targets. Like, no, I think it's just there's receivers right now. This receiver room between Zay, between Beckham, between Rashad Bateman, who I think has been playing much better over the last couple of weeks. These guys have to step up for Lamar Jackson, and I think Zay is going to be at the forefront. So I think that he's a screaming buy. Rookies break out in the second halves of seasons. Like, and Zay Flowers has already broken out in the first half. So I'm very excited to see what he can do. And I know it's funny. I talked about Jamari Douglas as like putting on this Amon-Ra St. Brown like rookie year finish, but now it's like, can I pivot to Zay Flowers?
I was going to ask.
The same thing.
We do have a bet of Douglas versus Flowers, so
I did make that before Andrews was going to put him.
Hey, Andrews are part of the game. Do you want to renege on our bet?
I mean, if someone sent me a trade for Demario Douglas, or I could trade Demario Douglas for Zay Flowers, I would do that. Like based on the new information at hand.
Sure.
So, I mean, I don't feel great about it. I mean, it was good for my bet that me and you made that Zay Flowers touchdown didn't count. So I was happy about that.
True. Yeah. I mean, that week 1 game, I mentioned it, when the trade, when the injury first happened, that's the most catches still to his career that he's had in a game, which was 9 of his 10 targets. It's also the only time he's rushed more than once in a game, which I think is a part of his game the Ravens haven't really, gotten into yet. Some of the, the wide receiver rushing with him. So I think a lot of the Zay Flowers, like whatever consternation there is around him not having a high ceiling, like, you're right. Receivers do break out in the second half. He also hasn't had his bye yet. We often see rookie wide receivers break out after their bye week. And again, he's kind of already broken out. Now, the fact that he still has a bye week left is kind of a bad thing because, there's fewer weeks left in the season. So that's going to mean, it's a greater percentage of the remainder of the season that you're going to get 0 points out of him. But I think all things are pointing to he can finish very strong. Even though he does have a couple of maybe not the easiest matchups in the world later in the fantasy playoffs. What do you make of Zay Flowers, Joe?
I think he's a great buy if you are kind of in the playoffs, setting up for playoffs. Now, I'll counter that by saying in week 12 against the Chargers, I'm expecting 25 points here. But then the buy in week 13, and the playoff schedule is pretty solid, as you mentioned. So again, if I'm in playoffs, I'm really eyeing up Zay Flowers as like a flex for my roster. I don't quite have him inside my top 20 wide receivers. I'm a little thrown off by the Dell usage, and he's getting a lot of first reads there, high percentage of the first reads. So they're making plays for him. It's weird, but I'm excited to see the offense here. With Likely stepping in, it has to mean more targets for Flowers. And it's kind of funny. As Erickson alluded to, we kind of already crowned Flowers as like the rookie wide receiver. But he hasn't even had his bye yet, as you said, Worm. So we're going to see, ideally, a nice little breakout here, weeks 14 through 17, and I'm in. Sign me up.
Yeah.
I think too, last thing on Zay Flowers is, and this just kind of goes to a larger scope of how the Ravens offense has scored points this year. I mean, it's all Gus Edwards rushing touchdowns.
Right.
Like, eventually, those touchdowns, because I don't expect the Ravens offense to just, like, not be good anymore. Obviously, losing Andrews hurts. But if those rushing touchdowns then regress to passing touchdowns, well, who are they going to? The number 1 receiver on the team, which is Zay Flowers, which alludes back to what you mentioned, how he doesn't have a high ceiling. Well, how many touchdowns does Zay Flowers have? I think it's 1.
That
right?
He hasn't had a high ceiling yet. Not that he doesn't.
Yes.
Going forward.
Yes.
And that one, he has not scored a touchdown in America because that one came in the international game.
I had the first touchdown in that game. I remember. I was very happy about it.
But to that point, if you watch press conferences and stuff, the Ravens want to get Zay in the end zone more. Like Odell talked about, he was like apologizing to the fans for that phantom holding call that cost them the touchdown. They've talked in other games about Lamar saying like, this is the game that Zay is going to have his huge blow up. Like it hasn't quite gotten there yet, but it's a goal of this offense. Like Lamar and Odell especially.
He has the most receiving yards of any receiver with just 1 touchdown. So he has 588 receiving yards and only 1 touchdown. Everyone else that has at least 600 receiving yards has scored at least twice. So like he's just naturally due for positive touchdown regression. It makes sense based on the fact that, well, Andrews is no longer there. So like they're gonna have to look for other options in the red zone.
Get food from your favorite restaurants, plus groceries and other essentials delivered straight to your front door with Uber Eats. This football season, stay planted on your couch and get anything, well, almost anything you need for game day by ordering on the Uber Eats app. Uber Eats, the official on-demand delivery partner of the NFL. Order now, alcohol in select markets. Product availability may vary by region. See app for details. Joe, give me your number 1 sell high wide receiver who you alluded to with the very professional tease earlier.
Yes, as one does. So my sell high wide receiver heading into week 12 is Tank Dell. Now, before everybody turns the podcast off, I'll say this. If you have him as wide receiver 2, fantastic. A flex even because you picked him off waivers, awesome. But you can cash in on Tank Dell for like elite fantasy assets like Brandon Ayuk, Keenan Allen, maybe, right? We can talk about guys with higher floors because when you look at Tank Dell's output, sure, the last 3 weeks have been awesome. 4 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks, but there's a couple games here where he played full allotment of snaps. For example, week 4, 70% of snaps, under 4 points. Week 8, I get it was first game back, but still 80% of snaps, 6 points. Some of these guys a little higher in rest of season rankings have a much higher floor. And then we look at Nico Collins, 1 touchdown here in the last 6 games. Obviously, he missed one of those, but 11 targets last week. That was actually more than Tank Dell. So this really isn't a negative towards Dell. It's kind of just like Collins is also really good. Dell is really, really good. So if we can trade off him and like package somebody for, I don't know, as I mentioned before, Brandon Ayuk, maybe Amon-Ra St. Brown, Stephon Diggs after a couple.
Travis Etienne.
Yeah, Travis Etienne always. But that's the thing, like Stephon Diggs, 2 sub 7-point games or whatever it is. Of course we want Stephon Diggs ahead of Dell. And like he's getting boosted so much to the point where we can start to do that. It's not the craziest thing. So I'm always in for a move like that. Or you just keep him and ride it out. And CJ Stroud has 400 yards every game.
One of the fun nuggets I like to look at on the rest of season rankings page on FantasyPros is you can see whatever their ECR is at this point for rest of season, it compares it to where they were drafted. And so you can kind of see, the progression of how players go. Tank Dell has had the biggest jump from where he was being drafted to his rest of season ranking. Well, it's actually the second biggest jump. Puka Nacua is higher, but he outside of Puka, who's kind of in his own tier in that, Tank Dell has had the biggest jump of anybody this season. He's up 58 spots in the ECR, he's wide receiver 16 in the rest of season rankings in half PPR. He's jumped 9 spots just in the last week. Do you think that's too high, too low, or just right, Joe?
I think it's a little too high. Mike Evans, for example. I prefer Mike Evans to Tank Dell. I prefer Jamar Chase, who we talked about. Garrett Wilson, DK, Olave, like that's kind of where I have Tank Dell, kind of around, low end wide receiver 2, like 20 to 24. But in the rest of season rankings, like if we can trade off of Dell for even Devontae Adams, Devontae Smith, all of these top 10 guys, maybe even DJ Moore, like I'm looking to do that with a guy I spent 20 fab on, back in week 5. So I'll cash in that way. And again, if you can't, don't force it because he's going to be good. The schedule is a little funny. He's got Denver in 2 weeks, which they've been tough. The Jets right after that, they've been tough. But then the playoffs, as Erickson alluded to, Tennessee twice with the Cleveland sandwich there in week 16. So it's going to be a wild ride with these Texans. Quite frankly, I'm here for it. But again, if I can add Amon-Ra St. Brown to my team for Dell and a running back, I'm doing it.
I was going to bring up the schedule too before tossing it to Erickson because it's a great point. It's just very funny to see weeks 14 to 17 at the Jets, Titans against the Browns, Titans again.
It's like the Squidward SpongeBob, meme there stage. Yeah.
Erickson, what do you make of Tank Dell again? Wide receiver 16 in the consensus rest of season rankings.
I mean, I think that's too low. I have him wide receiver 9 in the rest of season rankings because I kept ranking him as a top 10 receiver the last couple of weeks, and it's always had ECR. I'm like, well, why? Why not? Mm-hmm. Why are we all he does is put up what? He had 120 yards at halftime.
I know. I know. I am aware.
So for me, again, going back to what the rest of season rankings do, I'm trying to evaluate this is what I want because I have him 1 spot behind Keenan Allen, 1 spot behind Brandon Ayuk. So those are the guys you should be aiming for if you're going to trade Tank Dell. So you got to shoot for the ceiling here with Tank Dell because I think that the matchups is probably the key selling point. I can't get off of Tank Dell the talent and what he's able to do because again, the guy just gets open at will and CJ Stroud loves him and I just don't think that's going to go away. So I think those Titans matchups are going to be stellar, but Browns, they're a team that just makes games ugly. And same thing with the Jets. Games are going to be ugly and gross. And the one thing, too, is we haven't seen this Texans offense with everybody healthy on the same field at the same time, with Noah Brown, with Robert Woods, with Nico Collins. So Dell has obviously benefited from that, from guys missing time. That's not the only reason he's been breaking out, but just another layer onto maybe it's not 100 yards every week, maybe it's 60 because now there's more guys involved in the offense, Dalton Schultz as well. So I think that, right now, if you can cash out for something massive, I would do it. But if not, again, you can be fine just holding off your potential league winner in Tank Dell.
Erickson, let's stick with you for your sell high wide receiver.
Yeah, so my sell high receiver is someone that I think I compared to Gabe Davis recently on the show. It's Calvin Ridley for the Jacksonville Jaguars, who, guys, Zay Jones was back, so you should have started Calvin Ridley. That's the sign. It's got to start Calvin Ridley with the Zay Jones splits. I think there is some credence to that where I think that with Zay Jones operating as a legitimate threat on the perimeter, it allows the Jaguars to move Calvin Ridley around a little bit more because if you look at a lot of Calvin Ridley's routes this year, it's been he's running go routes, he's running curl routes, which doesn't take advantage of he's a good route runner. Why are we not using him more over the middle of the field where he can actually build leverage, use cuts, and get open, which is why we saw him have a big game here against the Tennessee Titans. Now, it also coincides that all the matchups that Zay Jones has played have been against like the Colts and the Titans and like really bad defenses and the Steelers, like things like that. So for me, it's still based on this larger sample size of Calvin Ridley has been a boomer bust wide receiver 3 all year long. Like that's what he's been. And occasionally those guys hit. Just like we saw with last week, Calvin Ridley in a plus matchup against the Tennessee Titans. It was like the best game we've ever seen from Trevor Lawrence from like a fantasy perspective. And he's been mostly underwhelming this year. So for me, Christian Kirk has been the guy that's been super consistent all year long. And I'm just afraid to roll into my fantasy playoffs with Calvin Ridley, scared that he's going to lay a goose egg for me in total Gabe Davis fashion, where I'm not going to get those boom weeks necessarily, even if some of these better matchups. So I think that the anchor bias with him from week 1 is still there. Like even myself, like thinking about Calvin Ridley, I'm like, oh man, like he could be the guy. He could be the wide receiver 1 still. Like that's still going on in people's minds, despite the fact that he is, I would say, overall underwhelmed versus expectation. I think that's why you can sell high on him for a more steady asset. I mean, like you could probably get Christian Kirk for Calvin Ridley straight up because of recency bias. So I'd rather have Kirk rest of season, rather have Nico Collins rest of season. Just a couple of names thrown out there for trading high on Calvin Ridley.
So, such a shame that his next game against the Titans is week 18, so not during the fantasy playoffs for most people. Is a bummer. I think that's a really great point on the week 1 anchoring too. Like he's one of the all-time great examples of that, where like that is in a lot of people's minds. Like I'm very
because I know because it's like in my
too,
mind,
yeah.
like it could happen now, like because the first thing we saw with him back was him being like totally amazing, and then it's like, well, it was the Colts. It was like,
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great point. Ridley, Joe, is at wide receiver 33 in half PPR rest of season rankings. Is that too high, too low, or just right for you?
Too high because he's ahead of Diontae Johnson, for example. I do have, Ridley as just like a low end flex here to finish the season, and that's what he's going to be. I get it. It's exciting, but if you still have Ridley, you've been rostering him for 11 weeks. This is like the dream scenario. You got 24 hours to get him off your roster. Get moving. Send for Diontae. Send for Kirk. Send for DeAndre Hopkins. Send for Nico Collins. Send for Zay Flowers. I could go on forever. And when you look at the playoff schedule, you really want to roll out Calvin Ridley at Cleveland in week 14. Oh, don't worry. Baltimore in week 15. No, I'm good. So get out of here. And also, like ETN was not involved. Kirk had a bad game. This is just not what we've seen for 10 prior weeks. I get it. Great game. If you can't trade him, for a wide receiver 2, running back 2, bench him, start in good matchups. It's pretty simple. Sometimes we overcomplicate things. I like to just keep it pretty simple. So that's my thoughts.
We're going to speed around some listener questions here. These actually, all 3 of these came from the same listener. And he did say, like, this is more of a shallow league because some of these names are going to be surprising that these guys are available on waivers. And I wanted to include it anyways because I feel like we often cater heavily to the deep league guys, especially when we do the mailbag segment of the show. So these are names that are probably not available in every league. Certainly a lot of leagues that I would play in would not have these guys available. But want to run through them anyway and at least answer this guy's questions. So, Joe, is it better to add right now Zach Charbonnet, Roschon Johnson, or A.J. Dillon?
We're going to go with Charbonnet there. I know the schedule isn't good. If you said Ty Chandler, I would lean Chandler. But over the other guys you mentioned, I'm going to go with Charbonnet. It's just going to be 15-plus opportunities for the foreseeable future. If it's in a bad matchup, so what? Guess what? Rookie running backs tend to overcome those things if given volume.
Erickson, Charbonnet, or one of the other two?
Charbonnet. I mean, he's going to be a bell cow. I mean, I think Kenneth Walker's going to miss like a month. Like, I don't think he's coming back anytime soon.
Question number 2. I know where we're going with this one. Better to add Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, or Zay Flowers?
So for me, it's obviously Zay Flowers. I will say Reed, not in the same conversation as Flowers, but if it's between Reed and Watson, give me Reed, which is funny. But, I posted today on Twitter, my waiver, whatever you want to call it, thread, and Jaden Reed was a headliner. He's been playing really well, get involved in the rushing game, designing plays for him, featured role. So he could be a guy to watch down the stretch as well.
Erickson, I know you're picking Zay, but Reed or Watson for the other two?
Reed, homecoming this week. Western Michigan, Michigan State product back in Detroit, baby. Jaden Reed is going to have another massive game on Thanksgiving, and I'm here for
Who
it.
would have thought Week 12 headline, Jaden Reed homecoming?
Yeah. Yeah. Question 3, last one here. Better to add at tight end, Isaiah Likely or Luke Musgrave, Joe?
I'm going to go with Lamar Jackson over Jordan Love. Does that answer the question? It should. In 4 games, I believe Likely has 4 games with over 2/3 of the snaps. He scored 18 or more fantasy points in 2 of those games. That's enough for me. So give me Isaiah Likely.
Erickson, Likely, or Musgrave?
I'm going to chase the ceiling potential with Likely. I know he's airballed his last 2 like big starts this year. But last year we saw a ceiling that we're never going to see from Luke Musgrave in that Packers offense where everyone gets 5 targets and that's it. And you're just hoping one of them scores a touchdown. Just Likely has a potential ceiling where he could be the guy. So where'd he go?
Where'd he go? Oh, he's back! From the top row. From the top row.
Sorry, guys, about that. Let's get out of here for Erickson and Joe. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Enjoy Thanksgiving. Enjoy all the extra, early week games, and enjoy as we head into the home stretch here of the fantasy season. I'm Ryan Wormeli for Erickson and Joe. We'll get out of here. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.